Hello and welcome back. In this early adopter, my first video, we're going to talk about scenarios. So Sparx scenarios are essentially a description of specific instructions that you see or sequences of events that occur when a system is used. In the Sparx EA, it's really not much different in the description. Scenarios are features that are used to describe and analyze interactions and processes associated with use cases, as we see here, and other components. So we're going to jump into this and get started and try to go through it as quickly as possible. I've got a playlist out there and other videos that cover scenarios. So we talk about it quite a bit. It's one of the most powerful features in Sparx Enterprise Architect that sets it aside from other tooling, but in computer-aided software engineering in general. So let's get started. So we can find scenarios in almost any element in Sparx. So when we look at a class element, if we are discussing this, you'll notice in the dialog box scenarios, and you can start building on a scenario for this class element at any point in time. This also applies in deployment views around nodes, execution environments. You see scenarios available in this element. In requirements, which is probably the most important place to do scenarios, same dialog box for the element or object that's in your architecture. And when we look at use cases, the second, if not most important aspect, it immediately goes to scenarios, right? So the only way to get to properties is to right click on it and then go to properties. You bring up the dialog box and you can get to scenarios. So same thing applies with test cases. So if we launch this test case, you immediately go into the structured editor for scenarios. In a document, we're going to right click on here and go to properties for this element. You can get to scenarios, which is kind of interesting because if you're doing a document that's explaining something, you can back it up with a scenario discussion around whatever that material is. So that's an interesting element. Now, boundaries, which you find when you're doing a lot of different things, BPMN analysis and so on, you cannot do scenarios. So we right click on this, we go to properties, you basically get the dialog box for shaping the boundary and doing other things. The same thing applies for notes. You cannot get to, if you view properties, I'll go into it, but there's no scenario. So you can't build a scenario around nodes. Today, we're going to focus on use cases, all right? And the same thing that we're going to apply here applies to all the elements that I just talked about that give you the ability to build a scenario using the structured editor. So to get started, I want to talk about patterns. And I have a use case pattern, probably the first pattern I developed years ago. And it contains or is already populated with everything that I want a use case to have into it. In this pattern, I give users and stakeholders that I'm working with instructions on how to build. And what's important here is that when we're looking at a use case, it has preconditions. It has your actors right here. And you're going to see that when we start building out a scenario, all right? Most importantly, it has your guarantees, your triggers, and then the scenarios themselves. So the main success scenario, and then you can add in other alternate path scenarios, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So we're in our demo project, and I've created a namespace called My First Scenario Demo. In a diagram, a use case diagram that's completely blank, using the same name. right? So you certainly don't have to use a pattern. You could just bring in a use case, double click on it, and then start building your scenario around that use case. But I don't want to spend a lot of time building out the scenario. I already have a pattern that gets me started. All right. So I'm going to go to model patterns over here, scroll down to the use case starter pattern. I'm just going to drag and drop this pattern into my blank diagram. Here we go. And there we go. And when I go over the project browser, we have our use case right here with all the instructions. Let's go ahead and bring this out to the right of the diagram. And then I want to remove this clean or blank use case and move this here. All right. So this way, when you bring this pattern in, you have the instructions on what a use case is and what a scenario is when you're building it out. And then you have the use case itself. So as stated here, you want to give the use case a very short active verse phrase. Our demonstration is going to be, our use case is going to be on login. So it can't get any shorter than that, right? And then you want to give it a long statement on the goal if needed. Now, when you're setting the goal, it's very important is that, well, what level is it? There's summary level, user goal level, and sub-function level. We are going to be at the summary level. So what I do is I'll just say, I'll choose summary, put that in there. We'll give it a short description. Our actor role here, and I leave the helper statements in there, especially in the beginning. I might strip them out later for other stakeholders so they understand when I'm showing or sharing a use case, what does this mean, primary actor? Because when we get into stakeholders and interest, we're also going to be having the notion of user, customer, agent, employee, and more, right? So you want to put your stakeholders and what their interests are, in this case, access management, the login use case, right? And then your preconditions, well, they're not logged in, right? You might put something like that. Minimum guarantee. And this is where you're actually start bringing in the nouns and the verbs that help you build out your scenario using the structured editor. So let me go ahead and complete this and I'll be right back. All right, I have populated my use case all the way down here. Just show you precondition, minimum guarantee, success guarantee, the trigger, main success scenario, extensions. These are your alternate paths and your exception handling. This is the technology and data variation, which supports the extensions above. It includes technology. So if we're going to be using application names, platform names, class names, etc., we might put the technology listed here all the way down to the technologies and variations. All right. So what I will do normally is I don't need all of this, but in this case, I'm going to probably bring in more than I usually need. I want to bring in my stakeholders. These are my actors all the way down. And you might be typing this out in Word, especially if you're using something other than Sparx for building scenarios. I'm going to take it just down to here. I don't need all, I can always reflect back on. So I'm going to copy this and then I'm going to right click here on this use case. I'm going to go to properties because I don't want to go right into the structured editor, and I'm going to paste that content within the structured editor. So we go into scenarios. I have a blank canvas here and I can put in anything I want, but I want at least the main scenario. I'm including what the trigger event is to start, some success guarantees. I've got all this at my fingertips, and it'll be included in any reporting that I might do at the element only level. So it's totally up to you. It's optional. You don't need to do this. You can just say, hey, what's this scenario about? And just put something short and concise in there. So we're going to hit save. right? So we have a basic path. It's called basic path. And what I want to do is I want to change the name to login basic. I probably could have just put login right in the beginning there, and I'm going to hit save. All right, now we're going to hit OK. Now when we launch this, we see that the scenario is a type basic path, not an exception or alternate. We'll talk about those in a moment. And it's blank and ready to go. All right, so when we're starting, I'm going to go back to the original use case. We have our context in here, what the goal needs to be. We're saying it's at the summary level right here, so we don't need to dive down into the user goal or especially deeper into the subfunction. We're at the summary level, all right? So this is simple authentication, starting with the original actor is a user, which can be any of these stakeholders, all right? And then we have a precondition, the user's not logged in. Right, and then go on. We're going to go ahead and go to the structured editor, right? And that automatically launches for you as soon as we open the use case, and we can start with our steps. So when you're first starting, keep it simple. Steps 1, 2, 3, whatever, just what's the first step, right? The first step is that whatever site they're on, it requires, I'm just going to say site, it could say page, requires login, right? I could do something like that. Now you'll notice as soon as I type the first step, it is an actor figure, right? And I can double click on this and change it to machine. So I'm able to change any of these as we're putting in our steps. So what's the next step? The next step is the customer logs in or user logs in. And again, if you want to be specific on customer or agent or employee, you can certainly do that. This starting out here, I'm just saying, hey, the user logs in. And then the third step here is that they submit their credentials. They submit their login credentials. I could put login credentials, all right? And then you can go through the other steps. Now you'll notice that, and I filled out the other steps here, you'll notice that I moved from user logs in to the next step. It has a machine icon here, all right? And then what it'll do is it machine actor, because it's thinking that you're interacting with, so the default is you're interacting with a machine, or an actor is interacting with a machine. And this stick figure, again, as I always say, an actor can be a human, it can be a virtual human, it can be a machine. An actor is an actor, all right? That's participating within the system, right? So we populated this, and let's go ahead and test with what we have by generating an activity diagram. So when you're up here, you know this icon right here? You can generate all of these types of diagrams. We're just going to pick the first one, activity diagram. And when we select it, it is going out and generating the activity diagram based on our steps. As soon as it's done, it lets you know generation complete. And we go, hey, there's a start, some sort of initial trigger. Site requires login, user logs in, they submit their credentials, render page, they log out, they're logged out, and then end. So it builds this for you. Now, is this a complete activity diagram that really represents what's going on for this scenario? I don't think so. It needs more. Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to build it so that we can add more. Now let's go ahead and close this activity diagram. If we right click on it and find in browser, you can see that this activity diagram is a composite of this activity element, right? Login underscore activity graph, right? So we created this element within our browser, right? But let's just go ahead and close it. So hey, this is blank. Why is this blank? Well, we got to choose the element that the scenario is on. So I just went over here in the browser and I selected login. Certainly could have come out here, selected log in, gone back over to scenario, would have done the same thing. It's just faster to choose whatever element you're building a scenario on right over in the browser. So we're back over in the structured editor. We're going to go to step 3, submit login. This is a happy path. They submit their login. They're going to go right to the page, be able to view the page. Not necessarily. What if their login credentials failed? What if there are other factors in which they're not allowed to proceed? Their access is not permitted. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add or throw an exception. So we're here in step 3. You'll notice up here, you can add an exception path or you can add an alternate path, right? Either one will work, but we're throwing in exception, right? So I'm going to go ahead and select this, and then we get this dialog box here, and I'm just going to choose login failed, right? Keep it simple. Login failed. Now, as soon as I do that, login failed shows up down here in my entry points, 3A. So it knows it's part of 3. It is the first exception or alternate path is tagged 3A. Let's go ahead and double click this, right? Now we have steps that take place for this exception called login failed. I'm going to go ahead and populate these to shorten the video. Otherwise, this video is going to become 2 hours long. So the steps that I put in here, not valid, login attempt, we're going to increment it. We're going to allow them 3 attempts. We're going to increment it, and we're going to return a message. Now, these are all machine events. So I'm going to double click that. These are all machine events, and we're done with this particular step or structure or scenario for login failed. Let's go back to our basic path and just double click down here. It goes right to it. You can also navigate to whatever your paths are up here in this drop down. So I want to go back to the basic path, select it, we're there. All right. So now we've got login failed. Well, what if login is successful? Let's go back to 3 here, and we're going to add in another exception. Could be an alternate flow, but it's not. We're throwing an exception within our code that login succeeded or successful. Put anything you want. Hard to change the name afterwards. So I'll show you that in a later video. But now we've got login successful. Let's go ahead and double click it. And I'm going to populate these steps next. Pretty simple. Login's valid. They're authorized to proceed. This is a machine event, not a human event. So just double click it, change it to that. It's not necessary, but just makes it cleaner to view. And now we've got that one in there. Let's go back to our basic path here. Now, when we're looking at these exceptions, they don't go right to the end. If I was to generate this right now, and I want to save time here, I'm not joining at the end. I am joining at particular points. So login failed. If I hit this, I get this drop down. It's going to go back into user login. It's going to throw them back to step 2 right here, right? And if login successful, well, it's going to render page. They're authorized to proceed. So what step is that? It is 4. Hit the drop down. I'm going to choose 4, and there we go. So now I've got my exceptions that are right here. You can see it's telling me the type, exception, exception, and where they go if something takes place. So let's test our scenario here and rerun our activity diagram. So go up here, generate diagram. It's going to auto-generate. We're going to choose activity diagram. I want to overwrite the existing diagram, right? And there we go. And it's going to start generating that. It is done. I get a message, generation complete. I'm going to hit OK. And now what I want to do is just move notes off to my other monitor here for now. I'm going to zoom out. Now I have a flow that's making more sense. So log in, let's go to pan and zoom. I have that, mine is over in the upper right. And if you want to get a pan and zoom, you go to layout, and pan and zoom is right here in tools, and it will bring up the same window. Now let's zoom in a little bit. I can either select an element and roll my mouse button and zoom in, or I can use the slider over here and pan and zoom to zoom in. So now we see that it moves from start, site requires login, user logs in. We go down here, they submit their credentials and it goes to this decision gate right here, right? So from that decision point, well, there's two flows. One is login failed, and then there's our steps. The other one's login successful, right? So if login fails, takes us back up, user login attempt. Now you can put a lot more in here, such as counters for simulation and those kind of things. Or you can actually start coding to this if you want to. But this, in this case here, login successful, render page, and then the user's going to do what they want to do. You could make this a composite activity that joins with other use cases or activities. Much more complicated. Let's keep this first scenario simple, right? Log out all the way down, right? So if I zoom out, rolling my mouse button this time, and I right click in here, execute simulation, now I can simulate and it's going to step through. It's going to get to the decision point. It's going to say, hey, was it successful? Render the page. Did it fail? So you have different points, right? So what I'm going to do is choose render page, hit OK. It's going to run down this path here, and it is going to end, right? So far, so good. That's our simulation. Let me go back over here very quickly, get to our use case for login. Let me bring my notes back over and dock it right here to the right. And congratulations, this is your first scenario. Now there's a lot more to talk about here. We're going to start wrapping up. This was very simple, very high level, not a lot of context, all right? When in the channel, in scenarios, you're going to learn how to build in and bring in context. You're going to learn how to apply uses, results, and build state machines. You're going to learn how to take nouns and verbs based on your context here. You can see these elements, this content is underlined. That means it has a context reference. You can do a lot more. You can build in constraints as you're going through. Now, this is more human readable, human active voice. Customer accesses e-commerce secure page, right? And then customer login using, and then all the way down, you're explaining what's taking place better in each step. When it gets to uses, you can say, hey, it's using whatever the use case is because this use case is in context. You may even reference requirements under use. It uses this requirement, these methods and procedures. You can get as elaborate as you want uses, and you learn this in a more in-depth scenario building video that I did. I will include the link in below. And then you're able to do things like not only generate more accurate activity diagrams, but because you did all of this actor, action, achievement, noun, verb, phrases in here, you can successfully build sequence diagrams. So we're going to go ahead and build a sequence diagram. And there we go. Hit OK. Now we have a sequence diagram based on our scenarios. You can generate test cases on this. Let's just generate very quickly an internal test case to test the testers can use for test planning. It actually scripted out what the test case is. It built the test case for you with the steps. They're not run yet in here for conducting tests on it. So you can start testing in the very beginning while you're writing requirements and before you've developed the very first line of code. Fun stuff, right? I hope you're enjoying scenarios as much as I do. It's a very important part of collaborating with your client stakeholders. In particular, you're going through requirements development. You want to better understand a requirement. create a scenario, step through the requirement from end to end, and even simulate it. Same thing with use cases or any element in Sparx Enterprise Architect. So this has been a great session. I was really looking forward to getting to it. In our next session, we're going to do my first version. We're going to touch on versioning, different approaches to versioning. And then after that, we're going to do my first baseline. So we're having fun and progressing quickly in the My First series. I hope you're enjoying the Sparx platform as much as we do as architects. It's not my only modeling tool, but it is my favorite modeling tool. So until that next episode, happy modeling.